Hi everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. I hope that we will be able to see me and especially my slides clearly. I am speaking from an unlikely location, and there are some logistical challenges. I am speaking over a connection with a hotspot cell phone. I don't have a wireless connection here. And thank you for your generous and very nice introduction. And please allow me to share my slides. And the title of my address today is, sorry, there is a mistake here. It's not raising, but rising from the bones of the mighty mother, post-diluvial fertility and the spontaneous generation of human beings. In the first book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Jupiter decides to punish a corrupted humankind by sending upon the earth an exterminating deluge. As Neptune himself strikes the ground with his trident, the blow opens cracks for the underground waters that gush onto the surface to submerge fields, cities, and temples, until nothing can be seen but a boundless sea. Jupiter's wrath spares only a couple of humans, Deucalion and Pyrrha, the best of each sex, who land with their small boat at the slopes of Mount Parnassus when the waters finally subside. Lonely and frightened, uncertain how to restore the human species, they resolve to seek the help of Themis, goddess of justice and good counsel, whose temple still stood, though disfigured with moss, her altars without fire. Moved by their prayers, the goddess so replied, "Depart from me, and veil your brows, ungird your robes, and cast behind you as you go the bones of your mighty mother." Deucalion and Pyrrha were, at first they balked at this apparently sacrilegious response, but Deucalion quickly reasoned that in fact, our mother is the earth, and I may judge the stones of earth are bones that we should cast behind us as we go. And so the pious couple did. As they went, hard and rigid stones assumed a softer form, enlarging as their brittle nature changed to milder substance, till the shape of man appeared, imperfect, faintly outlined at first, as marble statue chiseled in the rough. The soft, moist parts were changed to softer flesh, the hard and brittle substance into bones, and the veins retained their ancient name. And thus, a new humankind rose from the fertile loams of a post-diluvial earth. Soon after, the soil spontaneously began to produce animals of every species, in the same way, the poet notices, as the sun impregnates the slime left by the Nile after its yearly floods. While turning the soil, peasants thus find strange animals unknown before, some in the moment of their birth, and some deprived of limbs, imperfect, often part alive and part of slime inanimate, are fashioned in one body. Heat combined with moisture so conceives, and life results from these two things. I find it appropriate for the poster of this conference to feature an image. It represents a scene from the first book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, a different episode. Like those that I have shown in the previous slides, this engraving is part of a series produced in 1589 by the Dutch printmaker Hendrik Goltzius. It describes the so-called Age of Silver, when the primordial fertility of the earth began to decline, and humans had to learn agriculture in order to extract those crops. Then the soil was produced spontaneously. Using the language of myth and poetic fiction, the immensely popular Ovidian poem conveyed indeed the notions of the nature and history of the earth and of its generative powers that remained deeply ingrained into the European imagination well into the 18th century. The Metamorphoses was only one among countless works that in varying ways and forms tied together what we would call today the geological vicissitudes of the earth and those of life and of humankind itself, to the point that they can hardly be understood separately. In this address, I propose to inscribe the cultural history of of the Earth's fertility within this larger framework. Different conceptions of the nature and revolutions of the sublunary world entailed different possibilities for the history of life. Yet most of them attributed to the soil the capacity to spontaneously produce life forms that in the past, in the future, and perhaps in present times, could have included the generation of superior animals. Of all the possible scenarios, I would like to focus today on the most problematic, namely those of a fertility that may engender even human-like creatures, whether as the Europeans' own progenitors, or as the ancestors of other biologically similar, yet genealogically unrelated races and nations. While such hypotheses challenged and troubled the genesis story of the creation of humankind, I intend to show that their relation to Christian doctrines was in fact complex and multifaceted. Their unorthodoxy was far from obvious, and that in numerous instances they could be seen as complementing, and possibly even enlightening a scriptural account that all too often appeared neither straightforward nor univocal. Christian scholars, of course, were always aware that the book could not claim any monopoly on stories of the deluge of waters exterminated most of our wicked humanity. The idea that the present world emerged from a catastrophic deluge and that its physical decay went together with the moral and bodily decadence of the human species was pervasive actually in the Greco-Roman histories of humans and nature that remained available throughout the Middle Ages. Apart from Ovid's Metamorphoses, they intertwine inextricably in Seneca's Natural Questions, for example, where the fated day of the flood prepares a physically and morally corrupt earth for its next cycle, so that innocent people may be crafted afresh, and no teacher of worse behavior may survive. Plato and the Epicureans envisaged an earth that aggregated from both the combination and differentiation of pre-existing elements. In Plato's Timaeus, an intelligent demiurge famously gives form to shapeless matter according to geometrical principles. As the elements are set in motion, they tend to settle around the center of the universe in concentric shells, according to their weight, so that Earth mostly falls in the lower parts, close to the center of the universe, surrounded by spheres of water, air, and fire. Even in the eternal, infinite, and uncreated universe of the Epicureans, our Earth is but a temperate aggregate of atoms, with a linear history going from its initial formation to the final dissolution. And absent a supernatural creator, or anything resembling the modern concept of organic evolution, in Lucretius's Epicurean poem on the nature of things, living creatures once rose directly from the soil of a newly aggregated world. The species that were unsuited to these conditions could not find nourishment or could not reproduce autonomously when the fertility of the soil degraded, became extinguished. Both Platonian and Lucretian accounts, however, could accommodate regional or global floods that may temporarily restore at least part of its primeval generative powers. The periodical floods of the Nile, cited by Ovid in a previous slide, served as a demonstration of this principle, albeit on a smaller scale. Against this broader context, Genesis appears as one of many interrelated creation stories, a linear history of the earth and of humankind, from its creation by an intelligent author to the final conflagration, conflicted with some pagan narratives, but definitely not with all of them. Christian apologists were actually eager to appropriate and recast those that could be adapted to their worldview. In a short chapter of his etymologies, for example, Isidore of Seville conflated scriptural and Greek accounts that he saw as fundamentally compatible, once pagan sources were purged of elements like, guess what, the spontaneous generation of human beings, as opposed to the special creation by God. The deluge of the Greek tradition are not refuted, but they become local events against the universal one of Genesis. And so Isidore added, the fables of the Greeks say that humankind was recreated from stones by Deucalion because of the ingrained stoniness of the human heart. Among the ancient accounts of the earth, nature, and origins, Aristotle's immensely influential meteorology appears more an exception than a rule. since it describes an Earth that never began, will never end, and fundamentally looks always the same. The alterations that affect the globe are caused by the motions of the celestial bodies, in particular the Sun in Aristotle, which are cyclical in nature, and they appear chaotic or directional only because of the spatial and temporal limitations of the human experience. And so I forgot to turn off. But what I was saying is that the inhabitable quarter of the Earth mutates continuously, as one side is slowly submerged by the ocean, while new dry land emerges on the other. In a cycle that in the Middle Ages was normally supposed to follow the cycle of the precession of the equinoxes that was established by Ptolemy in 36,000 years. Aristotle too admits of periodical deluges, but in his universe, they can never be universal, and there will always be survivors. This last consideration is essential because Aristotle denies the possibility of the spontaneous generation of superior animals, let alone human beings. Every cataclysm must always be local, so as to leave survivors that can perpetuate their species. Pondering conflicting accounts of the origin of the world and of the human race, historian Diodorus of Sicily in the 1st century BCE recognized that he had no way to determine whether the humans who first established kingdoms and inventing writing were generated by the fertile mud of a renewed or new world, or instead descended from the survivors of a distant cataclysm. Diodorus, however, wrote that if periodical floods could submerge the whole of the earth, as many argued, on its latest occurrence, the destruction of living things was complete. The renovated earth then produced new animals and a new humanity, which bore no relation to the previous ones. These sources remained foundational in the following centuries. Until about the year 1200, European cosmogonies were mainly based on surviving sections of Plato's Timaeus in the Latin version, the Latin commentary composed by Chalcidius in the 4th century of the current era. Philosophical poems and treatises typically describe the linear evolution of the Earth that at first was entirely surrounded by waters, as the elements settled around the center, according to their specific weight. As the sun's heat turned water into air and fire, its level decreased until dry land emerged. This may continue until the final desiccation of the Earth and the extinction of terrestrial life. Alternatively, erosion may prove stronger and wash down to the sea every height until a boundless ocean covers again the Earth, as it did in the beginning. And I didn't have the money for this other animation. Maybe next time. Broadly speaking, such models were not regarded as competitors to the Genesis story. On the contrary, they complemented the moral and theological account of the Bible by showing how things actually happened in the natural world. Scripture spoke through images and allegories adapted to the understanding of common people in order to explain the why. Natural philosophy investigated the how, but there were two different ways to understand the same reality, and both valid. Plato's account also featured an intelligent creator that makes the world out of its own volition, of an act of free will. Now, the diffusion of Aristotle's natural philosophy in the 13th century complicated the situation, as Aristotle posited an eternal earth, and his supreme being does not create the universe with an act of free will. At the same time, the understanding of how the earth generated and continued to generate living beings evolved considerably. Soon after the middle of the century, Albertus Magnus still considered the possibility of a directional development, like in the previous slide. But in the end, he accepted a quasi-Aristotelian earth with cyclical deluges. He remarked, though, that there was an altercatio magna, a great dissension between the two towering authorities of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, also known as Avicenna and Averroes in Latin sources. Avicenna held that recurring global floods periodically extinguish all terrestrial life, but spontaneous generation can repopulate the continents once the diluvial waters recede. In this case, the influence of the stars provides the equivalent of the male semen, while the soft mud of the renovated earth is the womb. Once recreated, animal species can then reproduce sexually. Ivano is noticed, however, that while this could work for lower creatures, even under ordinary circumstances, large and complex animals had never been seen to rise from mud or decomposing organic matter. More faithful to Aristotle, the Cordovan philosopher maintained that a flood of waters can never be universal, so there will always be survivors. Albert seemed persuaded that global floods can occur naturally from time to time, like Avicenna said, and that Deucalion's deluge was the same as Noah's, not a later and much smaller ones, as generally established by Christian chronologists like Isidore of Seville. However, he also bought into Averroes' criticism of the limits of spontaneous generation. In particular, he observed that human beings, and perhaps even superior animals, could never be recreated this way, because in his opinion, a rational soul is not deduced from matter. And for this reason, the first human hypostasis, that is what makes the essential nature of human beings, were created and formed by God. But this left the problem of the settlement of the earth after a universal flood unresolved, because having just explained how this phenomenon of the global flood can actually happen, Albert was reluctant to adopt a Averroes' solution which only allowed for local inundations. And so a host of possibilities remained open. Whether spontaneous generation could produce human-like creatures unrelated to those endowed by God with an immortal soul was unclear. The medieval definition of human was indeed theological as well as biological, and its borders appeared shady and ill-defined. A human shape did not necessarily guarantee descendants from the first couple created directly by God in his image. Albertus had a quite high bar, and he did not even count African pygmies among humans, in spite of their human-like physical traits, manipulative abilities, and use of language. Now, while Albertus' understanding of human nature has been enlightened by Amalia Cerrito's recent studies, Daniel Ratkin has also shown that the German philosopher was instrumental in the 13th century astrologization of Aristotelian natural philosophy. It also affected theories on the generation of life. Building upon the work of Islamic astrologers and philosophers, European scholars in his time transformed Aristotle's vague connections between the sun's light and heat and the cycle of generation and corruption on the earth into a well-developed and interconnected system that took into account the influences of each planet according to their positions in the heavens. Acting upon the elements, but not upon the human soul, astral forces were responsible for long-term geological changes, as well as the production of minerals, metals, and life forms. It is probably not a coincidence that the first works describing fossils not as the remains of once living creatures, but as the incomplete products of the Earth's generative powers date back to about 1300. That is, after all of this astrologizing natural philosophy was developed. The most influential among them is probably Ivano's Conciliator. Historians of geology have always found it very difficult to understand how this theory could ever make sense, like fossils created by astral influences. That doesn't make any sense, right? But this, the problem is that you have to think about it in terms of life and in terms of generation, not in terms of rocks and geology. Hardly anyone questioned that lower animals, at least, could rise from decaying organic matter or mud. While the soil provided the matrix, astral influences acted like male sperm that gave the new living beings their form in Aristotelian sense, namely their specific being. A few decades before Peter of Abano, Albertus Magnus' Book of Minerals explained how rocks were shaped by a formative power that descends from the heavens through the influence of the stars, determining the particular kind of mineral that will be formed at any particular time and place. Albertus did not explicitly extend this process to the formation of stones with figures of animals or leaves, but only a small step at this point was required. Even when the starting point had been a creature that actually lived, the power of the stars could still contribute to the process that turned it into stone. In his vernacular scientific poem, Acerba, that until the 1500s had more edition than Dante's Comedy, it was very popular. Cecco of Ascoli described how a branch squeezed between two layers of muck left its impression on the contact surfaces as they hardened. A 1516 commentary of this popular work explained that the branch turned into stone owing to the antiquity of time and the operations of the sun and other celestial bodies. In the 1400s, Leon Battista Alberti related in his famous treatise on architecture the account of quarrymen that found in central Italy a snake that lived inside a huge boulder without there being any passage into it for air. He had witnessed himself the discovery of 3 leaves with a piece of marble, of the purest white. This is just an example. Detailed images of living beings or descriptions of living beings carved into stones were ubiquitous and often reported. Nature was definitely thought capable of producing works of art, but like in Cecco of Ascoli's Acerba or in Bernard Palissy's pottery 2 centuries later, the starting point of the process could well be actual animal or plants. Now, what the soil could produce depended on geography, which determined the astral influences a certain climate would receive, but in the long term, even on the slow revolutions of the heavens. In the early 1500s, the physician and philosopher Girolamo Fracastoro built on pseudo-Platonian theories to surmise that in the course of each great year, a time comes when the sun and the planets shine directly over the North Pole, then again over the equator, then over the South Pole, and so on. In other terms, the constellation of the zodiac would be completely different in a few tens of thousands of years. And one could then expect, under these conditions, vast geological upheavals, extreme seasonal variations, but also abnormal spontaneous generation with the production of extraordinary monsters that are not seen under current conditions. The possibility of the spontaneous generation of human beings, either in a post-diluvial world or perhaps even under circumstances not experienced in temperate climates, received renewed attention in the same decades as global trade and exchanges revealed the existence of humans in lands like America that apparently never had any contacts with Europe, Asia, or Africa before modern times. The existence in remote parts of the world of monstrous humans who may not have descended from Adam and were perhaps excluded from salvation was more or less a given. Encounters with similar creatures were not unexpected. However, Columbus reported that he did not see any monsters when he landed in what he thought it was the easternmost part of Asia. Instead, he met people that undoubtedly belonged to the human race and were amenable to Christianity. Once established that America was an isolated continent, not part of Asia, European culture was as ill-equipped to explain their existence as our science would be if confronted with human-like creatures found on planets around other stars. By and large, 3 options were available. Noah's descendants could somehow have reached America, in spite of the fact that their offspring seemed entirely ignorant of ocean-going navigation, and they had no memory of such travels. Alternatively, Americans were the result of a distinct divine creation that may have preceded that of Adam, a doctrine known as pre-Adamism, or followed the Noetic flood. Finally, human beings, or human-like beings, may have formed in other parts of the world by spontaneous generation after a partial or universal deluge, or perhaps thanks to the generative powers of other climates' soil. It is well known that philosopher Pomponazzi expounded on the latter possibility, in his university teaching, using as starting point Avicenna's discussion that already stimulated Albertus Magnus's analysis. Pomponazzi argued that while no conclusive evidence had been found for this doctrine, its falsity could not be demonstrated either, so that it remained within the realm of the possible. Unlike Albertus Magnus, he found Averroes' criticism of Avicenna weak and futile. In 1519, a young philosopher, certain Tiberius Ivano, who on the previous year had attended Pomponazzi's course, published a Latin work endorsing the eternity of the earth, arguing for the physical possibility of a universal flood, claiming that the earth had endured an infinite number of such inundations, that infinite more will come, and so on. So that the only miracle in the biblical story of the flood was not that it was actually universal, a physical impossibility according to Aristotle, but that unlike the previous ones, it left survivors. And this only thanks to the intercession of God. The recent finding that the human beings inhabited the Americas and the previously unknown islands, in spite of the lack of any contact with the old world in historical times, confirmed that humans can rise from the soil in the environment of a post-diluvial earth. Rusiliano narrowly escaped arrest when his apology was seized and publicly burned, and the book is indeed very rare right now, even though fortunately it was edited and published by Patrizia Zambelli a few decades ago. But it is highly unlikely that those doctrines could have brought Rusiliano on the stake without other and much more serious heresies contained in the book, like the horoscope of Christ, the denial of the virginity of Mary, and other nuggets. The opposite would have been unprecedented, and indeed the spontaneous generation of humans continued to be discussed openly. And in 1571, the great naturalist Andrea Celsalpino contended in his Peripateticarum Questionum Libri that the right conditions might exist even in the present world, as long as the necessary warmth and humidity are continuously available during the many months necessary for the generation of superior animals. It was certainly true, Celsalpino argued, that in the regions inhabited by the Europeans, such complex creatures were never seen rise from mud or decaying organic matter, unlike simpler ones. However, the reason is that the formation of large animals requires a long time, and he mentions the case of elephants, whose gestation can stretch for as long as 2 years, or almost 2 years. Outside of tropical regions, the animals whose formation may begin in the soil during summer will be destroyed by excessive cold in winter before they can be brought to completion. Yet, exploration travels have demonstrated that tropical regions provide the continuous humidity and warmth, together with small temperature variations throughout the year that are needed for the generation of superior animals. And so, in practice, a female's womb function was to recreate and maintain for as long as needed the soil and climate of the tropics, so that the whole of the earth could be inhabited. The whole discussion is actually an impressive document of how the image of the earth as the true mother of the living beings went well beyond the analogical and the metaphorical. And the sun, Celsalpino writes, is everyone's father, and the earth is their mother in a very real sense. So in fossils like this, excavated in southern Germany in 1543, in the quarry of Sollenhofen, a Renaissance observer could have seen a symbolic reminder of Noetic flood, or even a natural relic of the event, even though natural philosophers would normally disagree. More often, they would consider it a once living being that left its now degraded print in the mud when that part of the world lay at the bottom of the ocean, according to Aristotle's theory of geological change. Or even nature's attempt to produce a complex living being that aborted because the fertile mud dried out too early. Such hypothesis may seem patently heretical and in obvious conflict with the Christian dogma of the direct creation by God of the first human couple. Yet, it was not necessarily the case. First of all, those discussions were usually framed as problems in Aristotelian natural philosophy, with little to no references to religion or the revealed truth. As long as the philosophers steer clear of the theological implications, and he wrote philosophically speaking, or as a natural philosopher. That was the magic formula. He was normally allowed to do so. Second, before the late 1500s, established truths of faith concern only a few essential points, such as that the world was created in time and that there was the first human, the first man, unlike what Aristotle said. When and how exactly this creation happened was open to interpretation. Pomponazzi reduced the creation of animals in Genesis to an allegory of spontaneous generation, as astrological forces carried out God's plans without any need for his direct intervention. And there was nothing unorthodox in it. Just think, if you are familiar with Italian culture, of Dante's take on astrology. Of course, Dante Alighieri condemns deterministic astrology, but then astrology to him is just a force that operates in nature to carry out God's plans. In Italian, the general ministra duce of God's intentions for the world. Whether other creations took place that Genesis does not talk about, or whether nature itself could produce human-like beings unrelated to Adam and Eve, remained unclear. And even Jesuits like Benito Pereira, who produced in 1591 probably the most used and the most authoritative commentary to Genesis, grudgingly used even by Protestants. Even Pereira regarded the spontaneous generation of humans as a mistake, but a mistake in philosophy, and not a heresy, and possibly encouraged by the biblical account of the flood and of the creation of Adam from the clay of the earth. God creates Adam from the clay of the earth, and when the body is formed, an immortal soul is breathed into him. And so the creation of the body could even have been done by the earth itself through spontaneous generation. That said, the space for the spontaneous generation of humans began to shrink towards the end of the 16th century. And the rise of biblical literalism and the need to uphold the descent of every race from Adam and Eve in order to support European political and religious imperialism have often been cited as major reasons. Spontaneous generation also overlapped with and often supported pre-Adamism, namely, as I mentioned, the notion that other humans existed before Adam and Eve. Again, this was a doctrine that whose orthodoxy is less obvious than it might seem. Who were the people who, according to Genesis itself, Cain met when he was banned from Adam's family? Where did they come from? If Adam's family was the only one, if they were the only human beings. Both doctrines, spontaneous generation and pre-Adamism, appeared in a list of charges formulated against philosopher Giordano Bruno in the 1590s. But as Luigi Firpo pointed out in his classic reconstruction of the trial, this was a new problem for the Holy Office. Not in the sense that this doctrine had not existed before, but in the sense that they had not been prosecuted. Just like Copernicanism, that also appears for the first time as a possible charge against a philosopher. In his deposition, tellingly, Giordano Bruno confirmed to the inquisitors his firm belief that only Hebrews descended from Adam and Eve, while the progenitors of the rest of humankind had been created earlier or generated earlier, a statement that he was very unlikely to utter in those circumstances, unless he did not believe it to be problematic. 50 years later, Isaac Lapeyrère famously raised a huge scandal when he argued that Adam was the ancestors of the Hebrews only, while the Gentiles and the Americans descended from humans created much earlier. However, context and details, again, must be ascertained carefully. Various scholars have pointed out that the vast majority of Lapeyre's numerous critics were concerned with his attacks to the traditional doctrine of the original sin and on the authenticities of the Pentateuch, whose attribution to Moses he disputed. Pre-Adamism itself, or his contention that the age of the earth must be much greater than a few thousand years and basically eternal for all practical purposes, though not actually so, received much less attention. So to sum up, biblical literalism, political and cultural pressures against polygenism, the demise of astrology, which provided spontaneous generation with its intellectual foundations, all contributed to the late 17th century decline of spontaneous generation as a possible solution to the origins of humankind or of parts of it. The progressive mechanization of nature was, of course, another major factor. The theory known as preformationism that around 1700 became mainstream denied nature the capacity to organize inorganic matter into living beings. By then, new experimental evidence was also available, showing that even the smallest animals are born from eggs deposed by their parents, rather than mud or decaying organic matter. Yet the history of the Earth continued to influence and, to a certain degree, to determine the history of life and of generation. As the Aristotelian universe crumbled, the medieval concept of a global ocean that slowly subsides until dry land can emerge was recovered by authors like Leibniz and Benoit de Maillet around 1700. Since spontaneous generation no longer appeared a realistic possibility, de Maillet argued that animal species come from eternal and indestructible seeds spread throughout the universe that develop when the right conditions are met. Life on Earth developed first in the primordial global. Later, aquatic species adapted to the new environment when dry land appeared. So the mermen and mermaids, whose existence was widely accepted even by reputed naturalists, were our progenitors, but not in the sense that their species gave origin to a different one. Humans still belong to the same species that, given enough time, can adapt to life in different environments. Indeed, every terrestrial animal would have its aquatic counterpart. Organic transmutations and evolution are not there yet, but they are not too far either. Just like in the case of Earth history, which is the focus of my recent book, literature has often emphasized the 18th century breaks with previous scientific traditions while overlooking the deep and powerful continuities. The case of generation here presented today is a first attempt to bring together a number of case studies that give important cues, but we still lack an organic view of the history of the Earth and the history of generation considered together in pre-1700 Europe. And this might be another book that needs to be written. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ivano. That was extremely interesting. I'm sure there are questions for you, because this I can break the ice asking you my question, which is perhaps a request if you can expand, because it was fascinating, this account throughout the centuries of scientific ideas challenging the revelation, and how people would make sense of the fertility of nature. So my question is if you can expand on this sense of, as you said, divine seed spread on earth, about whether and how your authors have tried to emphasize the divinity of nature, to explain, rather than to oppose God creates the rational soul, then there are a mediated creation from nature. Was it useful to highlight the direct relationship between nature and God?
Yes, this is very complex. This is a question that would require a quite long and complex answer that I'm not sure I'm qualified to give yet, because really my investigation in this field is still beginning, really. So as for this indestructible seed of nature that I mentioned in relation to Benoit de Maillet's theory of the Earth and of generation, now you can find them very easily even in works written by ecclesiastics. For example, Athanasius Kircher in his Subterranean World. So Athanasius Kircher, who most of you probably heard of him, but he published most of his work in the second half of the 1600s. And in the Subterranean Wars, he gives an account of the origin of life that is somewhat similar. So he gives an account that is a non-literal interpretation of the creation story of Genesis, and there could not be anything unorthodox about it, because even St. Augustine, on the milestones of Christian theology, gave a non-literal account of Genesis. For Augustine, the 6 days of the creation were just a metaphor. The creation was instantaneous, and they were just a story adapted to the understanding of common people. And so in order to explain how the universe developed after the initial creation, without recurring to continuous miracles that not even theologians wanted, Kircher recovers that idea, which was not new at all, of these seeds that were created by God in the beginning. Seeds, they're not the seeds of every single creature, but the seeds of the species. And these seeds can develop as the condition on the earth become suitable. So, for example, the theory that I've shown of an Earth surrounded by a global ocean at first, and that then shrinks until dry land emerged in the Middle Ages, and then later, starting from the 1500s, it was recovered. This idea was used to interpret in a naturalistic way the second day of creation, when God separates waters from the earth. Did he make a miracle? No. Why? He didn't need to. He could just let nature evolve according to his plan, following the laws of nature, would say, that he instituted. And so what happens is that in the global ocean, first the seeds of aquatic creature start to develop and produce these animals. And then when dry land appear, even terrestrial plants and animals start developing, until you have the direct creation of human beings, or at least of the Hebrew people, by God. That was, of course, an unavoidable step, but that was about it. It was perfectly fine to accept or describe a naturalistic account of the formation of the universe, the generation of life, that is entirely naturalistic, until you arrive at the particular creation of human beings, or at least the human beings we descend from, because there could be other races that developed by spontaneous generation for centuries, and the orthodoxy of these ideas was disputed, but they could be discussed freely, entirely freely. And even Jesuit Pereira, about 80 years before Kircher, considered it possible. So I think that, and this is a consideration that I bring from my work on Earth history, we have a quite simplistic idea in many cases, not those who work specifically on very modern science and religion, they know, but a lot of scholars are not specialists. I think they have a quite simplistic idea of the relation between science and religion, we would say, and what was orthodox and what was not. A lot of things that we think are obviously unorthodox, were not necessarily so. There were sophisticated thinkers that argued for the opposite, and there was a lively debate. I had the impression that in the United States, for example, people just tend to project backwards young Earth creationism, 20th century young Earth creationism, and to think that it was just the relic of what used to be in the Middle Ages and early modern times before the rise of modern science. This is absolutely not the case. Young Earth creationism is a product of 20th century. Yeah. So it is a very complex and extremely interesting situation, and there was a lot of flexibility in Christian theology, both Protestant and especially Catholic, I think, at least until the late 1500s, when what must be held as truth of faith started expanding and ballooning incredibly. At a certain point, they even bring in Copernicanism. Copernicus didn't have any idea that this could be dangerous. It is astronomy. What does it have to do with salvation or heresy, right? He even dedicated the book to the Pope.
Thank you. I think your point about the flexibility, the possibility of this discussion, even contradictory interpretations, even in medieval Christianity, I think is really important. I remember Thomas Aquinas, but many others after him, just say these articles of faith about this other topic, there are different opinions. And there are, for example, in the Glossa Ordinaria, they are gathered contradictory interpretations, also including Genesis. I found also your point about the seminal reasons, the seed Augustine was talking about is essential, because as the text of Genesis says, God didn't do any work after his rest on this mysterious period of creation. So something is intrinsic to nature that God planted in the soil we are discussing this couple of days. But perhaps I should leave also other people the opportunity to ask you questions. Anka.
Thank you, Ivano. This was as fascinating as I was expecting, and even more. I was thinking of the encounter with the New World, or with the Americas that you mentioned, and the fact that in European art, always in Stradano, for example, native people are represented as cannibals. I don't know if you have anything to add on this. Are they the work of God? Are they the work of nature, of the earth? Or it's a complex discussion.
I mean, yeah, it is a very complex discussion, and there is a growing literature on this, and the literature on monsters is, I think, a corpus that is expanding, and it is very important to understand life and even a lot of things. I often tell my students that one important way to understand aliens or UFOs and abductions is to try to understand the Renaissance monsters, because we do have our monsters as well. Just we don't think of them in these terms, but they are our monsters. So as for your questions, it really depends whom you ask for what I've seen. These cannibals might be people who clearly do not have rational faculties like we do, and so they may be considered inferior creatures, not fully human beings, and the fact that you can interbreed with them was not decisive at all. Because if you think that they don't have a rational soul, educed from God, and for Albertus Magnus, not even African pygmies could be considered human beings. Of course, he never saw an African pygmy. He based his analysis on Pliny and other sources. They were not even human beings, so they could have been the product of a different creation of related beings. How about all of these creatures that have been talked about and shown in manuscripts and printed books since Pliny? And no, I'm not done. But another possibility. I was just trying to see if I can show again this slide. Okay, who are they? Okay, this is the Nuremberg Chronicle. The author of the Nuremberg Chronicle just says, oh, there are other different kinds of humans that God created because of his love of variety in the creation, and that was it. How about hermaphrodites? There is a big and growing literature on hermaphrodites. What kind of humans are they? Another possibility was that these are not different kind of humans, genealogically different from us, but they are decayed humans, degraded humans, and that after human beings came out from the ark and spread again through the earth, those who chose to live or ended up living in different climates had their bodies changed, sometimes to the point that they are no longer humans. So there is this very interesting intersection and discussion, and Sarah certainly knows much more than me about it, on how climate can change human bodies, how Europeans themselves expected their bodies to change in different climates, and it was a big deal when they realized that they didn't, that races were more fixed, apparently, and stable than it was normally imagined in medieval and early modern times. And so that there wasn't a univocal response at all. There are also a lot of political problems and political questions. So the settlers, Spanish settlers, at first wanted the Americans not to be really humans, so they could be enslaved without any problem. But of course, they would threaten the rights of the Spanish crown on these people, because the justification for the occupation of America was a conversion of the infidels. If they're not humans, they don't have a human soul. There is no one to convert. And of course, the church would not have any claim on them as well. And as it is well known, there was a series of determination in the early 1500s, till the final one by Paul III in 1543, I think, that established that no, they are human beings and they are fully human and capable of receiving faith. But the problem was the borders of humanness were shady. They were not really understood, and even the human races were considered to be much more supple and malleable than they were later, starting from the 18th or the 19th century. So it is really a very complex question. I could think of a lot of different authors and sources giving different answers to your question. They are different humans. No, they are degraded humans coming from the same lineage, and so on. At a certain point, and recently this has been emphasized by Lydia Barnett. It was known already, but I mean, it is good to repeat certain important points. Monogenism became important because if other races do not come from Adam, they do not commit original sin, and so they do not be salvation, and so they do not fall within the jurisdiction of the church and of European religious imperialism, which of course was the logical support to political imperialism.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Any other question? We have a few minutes left before the break.
If nobody has a question, I was also thinking of metals and the generation of metals inside the earth, kind of having their own life and growth and cyclical kind of life. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, because if it relates. If it relates in any way.
It does relate in the sense that the same forces that act upon metals and the earth in general can produce according to the situation metals, rocks, jewels, living forms, or forms that would like very much to be living, but that their production is aborted because of the lack of suitable conditions. And so these, starting from the late 1200s, these astrological forces, together with the heat of the sun and the metrics provided by the earth, are those that produce all of these entities and beings within the earth and on the surface, including human beings, and I guess including crops. And after all, the heat of the sun, the light of the sun, is just a form of astral influence. There was no real epistemological difference between heat and light and other celestial influences. Of course, we can see light, we can feel heat, but no one could deny the existence of tides. And the tides are obviously related to the reciprocal positions of the sun and the moon. There is some astral force that causes tides. It is not heat and it is not light, and so on. So this system of astral influences was and I think Dario Ratkin is right in this regard. It was really almost the equivalent of gravity in post-Newtonian times. It was the force that tied together the heavens and the earth, that acted upon the earth starting from the heavens. So in a certain sense, he had the same cultural function that gravity came to have later. And perhaps it is not entirely a coincidence that the demise of astrology in a high culture, at least, happened in the same times, the same decades as the affirmation of Newtonian cosmology.